We're now going to turn our attention to the biological basis of motivation and specifically focus on hunger, thirst, sex, and pain. So let's begin by talking about hunger. I'm sure as you've been preparing and listening to these these presentations, studying for the CLEP exam, you get hungry. It's natural, right? So you might ask, how does it happen? Where does hunger come from? So it's a complicated process, but for the sake of this exam, we're going to explain a few ideas. So first of all, it's important for us to remember that hunger is a biological instinct for survival. If we're not eating, we're simply not going to live and survive. So it's meant to help us have duration and longevity in our days and in our lives. Now, on the physiological level, here are a couple of the processes that occur. If I go a couple of hours without eating, my stomach becomes empty. I've processed all the food and there's no more food left in my system, and that will trigger hunger pains. And along with that, certain chemicals will start to be produced that will initiate the hunger and send signals into my brain that it's time to eat. Yeah. So specifically, glucose is a form of blood sugar that is produced from the breakdown of food. And basically, what glucose is energy. It's the energy that the body uses to meet its needs. Now, when food is actually, we'll come to this in a moment. Let me also point out that insulin is another of the important chemicals, and insulin, so I talked about glucose. Insulin helps to reduce glucose in the body and reduce glucose levels, thereby impacting hunger. Now, let's turn our attention to some parts of the brain that play a role in hunger. And we'll begin by talking about the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that seems to be the most important for monitoring hunger-related signals, and specifically the ventromedial hypothalamus, which is the lower middle portion of this area called the hypothalamus. This ventromedial hypothalamus appears to be responsible for stopping hunger. Now, stimulating this particular part of the brain will reduce hunger. It will depress my hunger. And damage to this part of the brain results in eating even when one is full. So even if my body physically has enough food in it, if there's damage to this VH part of ventral hypothalamus, I'm going to keep eating even if I shouldn't. Now, on the other hand, the lateral hypothalamus, or the LH, which is the sides of the hypothalamus, are responsible for increasing hunger. Stimulating this lateral hypothalamus will basically cause me to eat even among animals that are well fed. We know from research, and damage to this part of the brain will prevent even animals who are starving from wanting to go out and eat food. Now, in addition to these factors, each of us appears to have a set point. A set point is basically when the weight of my own body works to maintain this point that is stable for myself. Now, when my weight drops below this set point, then I'm going to have increases in hunger. And which obviously will make me take in more food and take in more calories. Activity level will also decrease if I reach this set point. Also, if you think about it, what happens when you get tired? You get lethargic, you start to yawn and slow down. At that point in time, my body is reaching its set point and I'm not going to take in as much food, again, reaching this set point. And if I am too lethargic and too sedentary, then that will also lead me to potentially increase in weight, which is, we know this is a big problem in our country, at least in the United States. Obesity arises in part due to some of these dynamics. Let's now turn our attention to some of the aspects of eating when that aren't in healthy states. And this is when we talk about eating disorders. So eating disorders are basically a result, most theories say, of social and cultural pressures to reach an ideal body image. And there are differences in eating disorders around the world based on the way media portrays the body. So we know that that's an important factor. And there are also biological and genetic features that contribute to eating disorders. Specifically, we're talking about two eating disorders, anorexia nervosa and bulimia. They appear to stem in part in adolescent girls, and also can be found in boys as well. And this is an increased goal to reduce body weight. In bulimia, there is a push to eat excessively, not necessarily to lose weight, but rather there is a need to binge and purge and get rid of the food in bulimia. And we also have a new disorder called, it's newly named, binge eating disorder. And binge eating is when people eat excessively and they don't have that set point working very well for them. So these are a few of the eating disorders. I encourage you to read more up on them as they can be quite impactful on our lives. Moving along, we're talking about now thirst. Thirst is basically produced by a depletion of fluid within the cells and around the cells of the body. The peripheral and central nervous systems are implicated in thirst. The subfornical organ and the lateral hypothalamic nucleus are features of the brain that play a role in triggering the body to reach out for liquids when it is thirsty. And angiotensin is produced by the kidneys in order to also facilitate communication to the brain, letting us know when we are thirsty and we need to satiate ourselves. Moving along to sexual behavior. Sexual behavior has been studied only in recent years, maybe in the past 60, 70 years, and we'll talk about where that came from in a moment. The origins of the sexual motivation in the body stem from the limbic system. Specifically, the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens are the parts of the brain that respond to sexual urges and sexual needs and relegate the sexual drives. The hormones that are produced in the body by the endocrine system are estrogen, and this is primarily in women, and then testosterone, which is produced both in men and in women, are as the actual primary sexual motivator physiologically is from testosterone. So it's important to remember that testosterone can be found in both men and women. Even though you may only hear of testosterone in men, it actually is found in both men and women and plays a role in sexual motivation. Let's turn our attention now to two individuals whose work was seminal in achieving our knowledge base in sexuality. Dr. Alfred Kinsey, very well known for establishing the Kinsey scale. The Kinsey scale was used to understand sexual habits in the 1940s, 1950s, and 60s and beyond. And it was used to categorize individuals' sexual orientation, among other aspects of sexuality. So it is through the Kinsey scale, and one of the versions of the scale rates people at a 1 through a 5 in terms of their sexual orientation. And so no person is necessarily has to be an extreme in terms of heterosexuality or homosexuality. They can fall somewhere in the middle in terms of orientation. So Kinsey, very influential in establishing our knowledge base. Finally, we have the research of Masters and Johnson. Masters and Johnson studied the sexual response cycle by actually conducting for the first time research on sexual behavior in humans. Very controversial research at the time. And they determined that the human sexual response has several phases to it. And the cycle, as it were. The first phase is the excitement phase. Next, the phase travels to a plateau, into orgasm, and finally it resolves through a resolution. And it's a scale that looks like a cycle that looks like this, and then suddenly after orgasm it drops down to resolution, and it's different for both men and women. Okay. Let's move on. There we go. We're back. We'll move on to the biology of pain. For the purpose of our exam, we're not going to go into great detail here. It's just valuable to know that the way pain works is that I first come into contact with whatever stimulus is causing the pain. It could be a thorn from a bush, a hot tea kettle, or a cut of any wound that I might receive. And the nerve endings sense the stimulus, and it sends that information over to my spinal cord and the central nervous system in order for me to know that I have pain. And then there is a pain center within the brain that further processes this stimuli and makes a determination of what to do, to react, to pull away, that perhaps I'm able to deal with the pain. And these are the basic aspects of pain production and sensing of pain. I have physical pain that have physical characteristics and intensity. I might have an acute or sharp pain, or I might have a chronic pain, something that's long-lasting. It can be something that lasts days, months, or even years. So these are the various variations in terms of physical pains. And finally, we talk about pain, social pain, which is the pain of a social disconnection. Maybe I lose a loved one, or I have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or someone that I'm a partner, and I lose them, and that causes social disconnection and social pain. And finally, there is, of course, psychological pain, which can be experienced through depression, through anxiety, through other mental disorders. Each of these types of pains has a different processing system, way beyond the scope of what we're talking about here for the CLEP exam. So this was a large chunk that we just covered. Make sure to go back over it and take some time to study the details of this particular section.